You're listening to Shoe In, covering the ins and outs of all things footwear, from sneakers to heels, loafers to slippers, and every type of shoe in between. Brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear.
Hey folks, welcome back to the Shoe In Show. Thanks for joining us today. There's a lot going on in the world, and all you have to do is look at any news site with a smorgasbord of crap thrown at you, from global politics to local politics to hurricanes to fires, floods, wars, famine, pestilence, you name it, on top of an orange man who may be in an orange jumpsuit soon. We're not quite sure. So the circus continues.
It does.
We need a ringmaster. So Matt, who's the ringmaster today to talk about these different
things? We have ringmaster extraordinaire, and that's Frank Lavin, who's former ambassador to Singapore. He's former Reagan White House aide. He is former undersecretary of international trade. That's when I worked for him at Commerce. He is the founder of Export Now. He was at the Republican debate last week. He is a thought leader. He's a lot of fun. Frank, you've been on a Shoe In Show before, but welcome back, my friend. It's so good to have you.
Thanks, Matt. Really glad to be back. We always have a fun conversation about current events and where the world's going. And Andy, good to see you again. And look forward to a nice chat today.
All right, first out of the gate, you were at the debate. Yeah. There wasn't a lot of China talk. We're trade liberalizers. We're pro-trade. There doesn't seem a lot of we're like a dying breed, it seems. What's the latest and greatest when it comes to trade and the Republican Party in particular?
Yeah, unfortunately, in a real break with recent American history, in a break with, say, 80 years of modern American history, we've had now at least two presidents in a row between Trump and Biden who are both skeptical or hostile to trade, and they both had very similar kind of results, that the U.S. needs to pull back and U.S. needs more protectionism. And we have never had a successful trade initiative that didn't have presidential leadership. By the way, Trump, even though he had a lot of rhetorical hostility toward trade, still did a digital free trade agreement with Japan. He still mooted the U.S.-UK free trade agreement, and he launched negotiations with Kenya. So even though Trump had a lot of sort of emotional hostility to trade, he picked and chose a few initiatives that sort of made sense to him. Biden isn't even at Trump's level. Biden is even more hostile. So unfortunately, we're at kind of a down moment. I made 2 points at the debate to people I was talking with to say, first of all, no trade policy should be 100% stick and 0% carrot. If you are concerned about unfair trade or things going wrong or malfeasance, don't be 100% defensive, right? But find your own initiatives. Find like-minded nations that have a good standard of living, are rule-based, where we can actually make headway. But that in itself will help move the system our way. That will give our workers and our factories, our business, more connectivity with other like-minded nations. So if all we do is say my view of trade is to play defense and be a traffic cop and throw a flag on the play, you're not going to take the economy ahead. So that's the key message I would give to Republican candidates.
Now, were you surprised being at the debate, and there'll be subsequent debates, there's one at the Reagan Library upcoming, Fox Business, are you surprised that there wasn't more kind of anti-China rhetoric, at least at the outset? Because it seems like the one bipartisan issue in this town, Frank, is China sucks, and what bill do I sign on, and how do I kind of voice that publicly? And so what are your expectations going forward as it relates to the Chinese and how we're going to play it?
Yeah, Matt, first, I think your premise is accurate, that there's an enormous amount of hostility or ill will toward China. It's sort of been building over the years. There's a political military set of concerns about their posture in the South China Sea or their appetite vis-a-vis Taiwan. There's their new friendship with Putin and the support for what Putin's doing. There are also economic issues. These are traditional ones to say, look, they've got a higher tariff than the U.S., they have more trade barriers than the U.S., and how much sense does it make to engage with them economically when they're not playing fair or playing in a symmetrical kind of way? And this unhappiness has been building for some time. So it's no surprise that it's finally gotten to a critical point. Look, I wasn't surprised this didn't figure in a central way in Milwaukee at the Republican debate, because the debates are driven by the moderators. So they picked the questions, they picked the topics, they picked the themes. I didn't think it was a bad exposition. It gave candidates a reasonable chance to say their side of the story, but no real heavy emphasis on foreign policy issues. Ramaswamy and Nikki Haley got into Ukraine a bit, so there was that sort of carve out, but there wasn't really a general discussion of U.S. role in the world or U.S. Trade policy. That we might see more of that at the Reagan Library.
Yeah, I actually watched this debate. I've been kind of tuning out to some of the debates lately. I haven't been really impressed with the questions and some of the responses. I feel like, 20 years ago, we'd have some idea around a policy position, and now there's a lot of talking points. And when I tuned in, I was confused because I thought I was watching Tommy Boy, where we had Chris Christie as Chris Farley and Vivek Ramaswamy as David Spade. So I wasn't quite sure what I was watching, but I thought for a minute it might devolve into a WWE wrestling match, which it did not. So that's positive. But also, just want to ask you your kind of viewpoint on the race in general as we keep going down on this. When I finished watching the debate, this is kind of counter narrative of what I was listening on the different from the different pundits. I could foresee a world without Donald Trump in the Republican Party.
Yeah.
I could see people moving on by him not being there. And I know that the common narrative is he's so far ahead he didn't need to be. I understand that from a campaign perspective, but from a cognitive perspective, it gave an opportunity for people to think, well, there could be a future there without him.
Yeah, and Andy, I'm 100% in agreement with what you said. I said his absence and the ability of other candidates to just articulate a vision or viewpoint or answer a question allowed the general audience to conceive possibly as one of these other people as the nominee. And Trump's absence, I think, doesn't help him. So I think he fades just a little bit. I think he's still in the lead, but he said he's going to be absent from the Reagan debate one as well. So I just don't think it helps him. The more you allow people to think of, well, could Nikki Haley be president? Could Mike Pence be president? Could Tim Scott be president? And I have to confess, I'm supporting Tim Scott. But could one of these people be president? The more they think about that, the more we don't need Donald Trump the way you might have thought we needed this guy.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess we'll see, because, I mean, that's over the last several years since he's kind of taken control of the Republican Party, the question has been, the traditional planks has been conservative, fiscally sound, local government, and everything kind of seems flipped on its head where Republican, and Nikki Haley pointed this out, which I thought was amazing, all the spending that's occurred under Donald Trump and the Republicans in Congress, and then looking at federal encroachment on local elections. Regardless of how you feel about what's happening in Georgia, the calls from a president down to a secretary of state overseeing a state election, it was federal, but it's state election kind of constitutionally, that's the responsibility and the duties.
Christie had a very, I think, insightful comment in the course of the debate. He said, even if Donald Trump is innocent of every single one of the 90 whatever indictments, the 4 general cases against him, even if he's innocent across the board, doesn't his conduct fall short of what we want to see in a president? So don't only focus on the specific legal problems, but to say, is this what you want in a president? And shouldn't we seek the best people and people who have leadership and compassion and the ability to build coalitions and take America in the right direction, not just the angriest guy in the room or the most theatrical guy in the room or the guy who will throw the most lightning bolts or create the most friction, but someone who can lead the nation to the next level, right? I thought that was a very insightful comment.
Let me ask you, Frank, let's kind of pivot back to trade in a sense, because right now you mentioned the Biden administration's even weaker on trade. If for those of us who believe in trade liberalization and as a diplomatic tool, as an economic tool, et cetera, as we head into 24, we've got Trump and others basically saying we need to put a minimum tariff on everything, 10%. And for us, that would be a steal for some of our items. But how are we supposed to generate, speaking of building coalitions, a coalition of the willing to drive more trade liberalization, to drive the leadership? Yeah. Is there a small ball play here somewhere, Frank?
I think so. By the way, I think you're absolutely right to at least have a specific idea out there that people can warm to and respect and you can build a coalition around, because I think the more abstract the conversation is, the easier it is for anybody hostile to trade to sort of project their personal fears onto that issue. But the more technical make it. For example, most of our trade initiatives over the last few decades have had a foreign policy or security component to that. So we did free trade with Mexico, which I think was very important in stabilizing the Mexican economy. We did free trade agreement with Australia, which is a great alliance relationship. We did free trade agreement with Israel, which is an important alliance relationship. So most of these have some, I would say, think about a free trade agreement with Britain. Think about a free trade agreement with Taiwan. Think about something that is not huge, not major. And what's great about Britain, by the way, Taiwan's got almost the same per capita GDP, not quite as wealthy as Britain. But the point is, you're not going to have this labor arbitrage argument that hostile parties make to say you're going to export jobs. No, nobody is going to take an auto plant or a steel plant in the United States and move it to Britain or Taiwan. So there's not going to be that labor dislocation. You might see some other arguments. So I don't think there's a natural hostile constituency if we picked a market like that and got that going. I'd also say I think it's worth looking back at TPP, that old Trans-Pacific Partnership. China is so active in East Asia. It doesn't make sense for the U.S. to stand still. China's not standing still. The world's not standing still. Technology's not standing still. And the U.S. is standing still. So we're conceding 700 million people of Southeast Asia. We're conceding that to be in China's economic orbit if we don't do something in that place.
Well, we're losing time. We're not only are we losing time, like geographically, economically, and diplomatically, we're losing time politically in the sense that there's no trade promotion authority, and we're now going to have we're going to have a new Congress come in after the 24 election. We have a new Congress now, or 6 months in, or whatever, 8 months in. And we're going to lose muscle memory on what even TPA is to help drive a lot of those potential free trade agreements you talked about. That, if you're not passing this down one generation to the next, then you lose it altogether. And so that's what I'm fearful of. I'm fearful that there are not enough champions. We just can't coddle. The Kevin Brady's are gone, right? We can't coddle together those House members that believe in trade and think that the president should have authority to negotiate trade agreements. And we have a president right now who's not even seeking it. So right. I think we're losing time, and it's unfortunate.
I had a depressing conversation with a friend in the Biden administration to say, I understand that President Biden is very sensitive to unions, and he's kind of a status quo guy anyhow, and he doesn't want to step on any toes. I get all that. I get our starting point is not a strong starting point. But isn't that why you have a Commerce Secretary and a USTR, so at least they can rhetorically at least talk about the importance of trade, so at least you see where does the market stand? How far can we go? But when the starting point of USTR is we're not going to do anything, and the starting point of Commerce is we got no appetite for anything, then you're asking for a bad result. You're asking for the worst voices in Congress to dominate. So I said, at least get some positive voices out there, some positive ideas out there to allow people to say that open societies move ahead and closed societies stagnate. And let me, if I can just digress for 1 second,
sure.
I'll make a prediction for the entire listening audience of Shoe-In that there's not one person listening to this podcast who is going to go out and purchase a French automobile. Because French automobiles, I'm not knocking the French automobiles are not world class. They're not world best practice automobiles. Why is that? They're just as talented. The engineers are good. Their workers are good. They're just as talented as anybody else. Why? Because they did what the Biden administration, Trump administration did. They said, let's use protectionism. Let's use industrial policy. Let's make sure that every French auto has 100% French components to it, and that way we'll help our economy, we'll help our workers, we'll help our jobs. No, all you've done is build cars that aren't world class. You cannot be globally competitive because you had a national level strategy that really hurts workers, hurts investment, hurts consumers, and you move from top tier producer to second tier producer, and it only took you a few decades.
Well, they got enough wine they're getting rid of now. Maybe that can help fuel some of those automobiles. Let's talk China. I am personally very concerned about what I'm seeing in terms of the economy. But what's more troubling is things that I've been reading that I didn't even consider. So I think we always know that China fudged numbers on their economy, right? If they said it was 5%, it was probably 4%.
Right.
But recently I read an article where that was saying like they could possibly even, and this person was very certain that they were fudging numbers on their population. And it makes sense because for many years, the more people you have, the more foreign aid you could get. I mean, to this day, there's still countries paying China to own sustainability and on environmental issues, right? So they're still getting money, even though they've grown to superpower status. I don't know how, a great power status, one of the top tier status. So that was concerning because, like we've been saying, well, their population's declining, and maybe it's even lower than what we thought, and that impacts their economy. And obviously, Frank, we make shoes there. A majority of shoes sold in the U.S. are made there, but businesses have been banking that that's going to be their growth market. And I think they're waking up from the China dream with a headache, a little hangover, perhaps. Maybe you can speak to how you're reading the market right now and
Yeah.
what's happening.
Andy, I think that's a very fair analysis. I think there's been a series of issues over just in the last few years, after several decades of outperformance in economic growth, several decades where China led the world, certainly in the major economies led the world, 5, 6, 7% growth for an extended period of time. To have them come back to earth is quite a shock. So there's two or three things going on that are all negative. One is this tapering of economic growth down to real world levels. It still might be respectable 3%, but boy, that's not the golden moment of 7%. The second is COVID, and the lockdown was extraordinarily disruptive to business practices, to retail, to shopping, to some consumer goods, to even relocating personnel and moving in and out. And third point, which we've been talking about, is the political deterioration. It just people are less comfortable with China as an operating environment than historically they had been. So I would say China is still an important market, still a huge market, but it had a privileged place in a lot of business decision making for decades, that it was viewed as the strategic market, and you would typically find U.S. companies over-indexing for China, meaning the global majors, the Procter and Gamble, the General Motors would have their sort of index about how do we allocate resources and investment and marketing and team, and what do we put into Indonesia and what do we put into Turkey, and then they've got their algorithm and a team, the strategic planning team that does all that. But without exception, you'd have the majors would say, look, we've got to heavy up beyond that for China, because China is strategic in the sense that it's so large and it's growing so fast that if it's a bit of a gold rush going on now, and if we don't claim our stake in it now, the market's going to be locked in, and we will regret this. So you had the Coca-Colas of the world and the Procter & Gamble's of the world really saying, put money into China. I think that moment is past. I think you're saying it's large, it's a great market, we like it, we can make money there, but we are indexing it in the median now. We are treating it like the way we treat any other market, adjusting then for size and GDP and population and so forth. So it's unfortunate in some respects, but I'd say some of this is policy driven from Beijing, that they had not calibrated their policies to be increasingly open and increasingly user friendly, so to speak, helping their consumers, their businesses, their investors as well. And so you end up at a point where the cost and the burden continue to bubble up, and the promise and potential is in a bit of a decline.
And I was reading too, like where there's this whole notion of the economy shifting and changing to more of a consumption based model, but the problem was they missed the boat because it should have been shifting 10 years prior based
Yeah.
on
And it's
all the
hard.
economics.
It's easier said than done, and a
Yeah.
little bit. It's slightly. You're right. That's what they should do, but it also somewhat violates the state religion, meaning the Communist Party leadership is not as comfortable the way we might be in the United States with sort of celebrating personal consumption. To say we view that as a sign of successful economy. People can live life on their terms and purchase what they want. And, if you want a latte, go get a latte. It's okay with me. But in China, there's at least some leadership strata who say this is self-indulgence and it's hedonism and it's not even productive, and you're spending a lot of money on Nikes when you could do something else with it. So there's almost kind of a puritanism that runs through senior leadership.
Is the light of Deng Xiaoping out at this point? Have we kind of migrated away from the great opening and the economic liberalization? Are we retreading from that? Because it just seems like they're in this desperate situation. We saw last week where and I am anchoring this in real time, this conversation a little bit, but we saw last week where they're going to not report the unemployment rate for 20-year-olds. They're like, oh, nothing more to see here. They seem to be kind of always manipulating in a fit of desperation. And even the one-child policy, you can argue morally what that means, but even sociologically, they overplayed their hand significantly. So I'll say this real quick. For all the fear I hear from my friends who watch Fox about how China's going to eat our lunch and kick our ass, they have a lot of structural internal problems. Am I right?
Yeah. Yes, I would say this point that there is enormous amount of rigidity and insularity in a dictatorship that really makes it hard for them to adjust. They don't get feedback. They don't have open conversations. So if you are the vice minister of health in China, this means you're in your early 60s. It means you've been a functionary in the health ministry for 40 years. It means you're a party member. It means life is good. You're vice minister. You're vice minister, and there's a better than 50-50 chance you're going to make minister. And if somebody goes to you one level up, somebody from the Central Committee goes to you and says, hey, you're in charge of all this population issue. Is this really a serious problem or not? You have extraordinary incentive to downplay that, to say, well, we had some disruptions because of COVID, and definitely we had a year or two of bad numbers, but we don't think it's that. We think once we tweak some of the incentives, we think we're back in the game. But you have extraordinary incentive to play it that way rather than to say, holy cow, our numbers have just fallen apart. We got to really have some capacity to experiment, to try different things, to empower people to understand what's going on here, or we're going to be in trouble. So bad news doesn't get surfaced, and ideas don't get surfaced, and everybody has an enormous incentive to go along with the system. It's that old question with if going to North Korea for a second, if Kim Jong-un asks you if you think he's overweight, there's only one answer. You got to say, you look great. You look great. So you get a lot of positive feedback in this system, and you don't have somebody saying, look, we really have to experiment with what we're doing in our social policy and why people aren't having 2 kids, and what can we do to incentivize them to make better decisions. So I think you're right. There's a lot of rigidity. There's a lot of insularity, and the supreme value in that system is internal cohesion, not what's the best answer, the right answer, what solves the problem, but just, are you one of us, is the one question on the job interview in China. And you better say, I'm one of you, I'm a team player. Then you're going to get promoted to be health minister. Right? And you say, you know what, I'm only here for a few years as health minister before I retire. What incentive is there for me to blow the whistle on this thing and say, we got a real problem? Right? What I ought to do is calibrate some minor adjustments, some minor incentives, to say we're going to now provide daycare subsidies for moms or something, and put some money on the table, and it kind of minimizes the problem, falls way, way short of what they need to do, and I'm retiring in 3 years anyhow, right? So that's what. So the point is, they are playing catch up, but they're actually losing ground because they're going to be undershoot the market with incentives, what they need to be doing for several years. This demographic problem, I think, just gets worse over a number of years, and I don't think it's until Xi Jinping retires that somebody can actually blow the whistle and say, by the way, we're not in the game. We've really missed the ball here.
Yeah, I think if they wanted to get their economy back up to 7%, it would require a huge government intervention and shock beyond what they're willing to do, because they long term don't want to be seen as bailing anything out.
Right.
They want to, they're not going to be in the bank of last resort for China, and they don't want to build that into it. And so it's just, and I think there's people think so much about Beijing, but the interaction between provinces and even localities with the federal system that they have, that's a lot of rub, because the Beijing saying you still got to hit these targets, and the regional folks are saying, to hell with that, there's no way. We can't sell property, and that's how they've been growing, right? Property, typically.
I remember I started working in China with Citibank, and I remember I can't remember, this might have been 20 years ago, but I remember one year that they present national GDP growth numbers, and they also prepare provincial level GDP growth numbers. But every single provincial growth number was above the national average. So every province came up with a number that was higher than every one. It wasn't like there's one where things are really bad, but so whatever that national number was that year, 6.5, every single province had a number higher than 6.5.
Right. Say, well, it's like our podcast. That's our podcast numbers, Frank. I think there's like 333,000 footwear workers in the U.S., but we're averaging 400,000 listens a week. I don't know how.
Amazing.
I don't know how. So it must be doubling up. Or
I always listen to your podcast twice, and I use 2 different email addresses just to make sure it's counted twice. I don't want to cheat anybody.
That's what I'm here for. What do you think, before we pivot, because I know we want to talk Ukraine really quickly, what do you, when I did my IR masters, I don't think I realized when I was working in Congress how important theory is, because there's this idea that business people don't understand politics in terms of there's not math equations for how you deal with people with egos who have missiles, right? Like that's just fundamentally not how politics works.
Yeah.
And I remember like some days, depending on how my boss walked in, whether she was whistling or angry, was how she was going to vote that day. Some of it didn't have anything to do with the policy, right? So we have these things, but like, how do you, from your experience, theorize about how China acts out regionally, military wise or power projection wise, when they're going through economic
Yeah.
distress?
Well, there are two or three drivers here, and it's almost a whole separate podcast. One is what we said a minute ago. There's just a lot of rigidity in that system, a lot of insularity in that system, and domestic requirements overwhelm international requirements. Meaning, what's important for me if I'm a mid-level officer in the Chinese Navy or a diplomat, what's important for me is not that I try to improve relations or improve outcomes overseas. What's important to me is I tell those guys back home, I did what you told me to do. So you have typically a sort of an over assertion or overstatement from the Chinese side. There's no ability to taper down or to restrain. You'd say, what makes a great power great is not the assertion of power, but the restraint of power. But China has very little ability in that second category. They're still in sort of an assertion mode. So when they say, let's harass the Philippine Navy ships that are resupplying this Philippine contingent on this old ship on this reef, who in the world would think that's a good idea, that there's going to be a good response from the Philippines? What you guys ought to be doing is cultivating friendly relations with the Philippines. They're your neighbors, a good trading relations, invest in tourism, students, anything you want. But why in the world would you ever say, let's have a fist fight about this particular piece of property? But boy, it is very, very difficult in the Chinese system for everybody to say, we think we've overshot and we need to dial it down a bit. Let's try to have friendly relations with our neighbors. That is not what drives them. So you have an economy in a country that is an ascendancy. Their economic growth is outperforming the region, and they have a need to assert themselves, and that drives a lot of their behavior. And there's no internal restraint mechanism. So you call it autopilot nation. The whole system's on autopilot until they encounter some external friction or external problem, then they can pull back. So I think we're in for intermittent friction for the near term with China.
I will say that Secretary Raimondo's recent trip, I think, in my estimation, the economic pain domestically is starting to change their posture towards us, at least to relaunch strategic dialogue or whatever that looks like in a formal sense, because they need those tariffs to come down. They need to continue to ship more product to U.S. consumers. And I think their posture is starting to soften just a little bit as it relates
I think you're right. I think, look, they kind of overloaded the system. They have so many problems going in so many respects. They have just so much friction going, and they don't have a huge constituency of friends and goodwill and so forth. So I think they have realized they need to dial it down a bit, and they just don't want open-ended hostility. That every relationship needs some level of architecture to it and some buy-in to it. And they were at kind of a dangerous point with the U.S. There's so much hostility in the U.S. to say, if people say there's no value at all in this relationship, that's a very dangerous point to be in. Then there's no cost or problem with just increasing that friction.
So talk to us about the special program that you have with the Ukraine. I saw it on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
You're raising money. It's super ambitious, but walk us through what you're doing, what's on your heart, and what are you going to be driving in just a few weeks' time?
So I'm volunteering for a British charity called Medical Lifelines Ukraine, MLLU, Medical Lifelines Ukraine. And what they do is get used medical equipment, ambulances for the most part, and refurbish, recondition them, get them all in ship shape, and then deliver them to Ukraine. So I'm part of a convoy that's leaving next week. I'm flying to London next week, joining a 4-ambulance convoy, two drivers in each car. I'm one of the drivers, and I'm driving to Ukraine to turn over these ambulances to the hospitals and the health ministry in Ukraine. So it's a donation, it's a charity. Wow. And we're all volunteers. In fact, I had to pay my own way. To London, but very grateful for this chance. Look, I think this is an important fight for the U.S. and U.S. security. So I've mentioned before I'm for Tim Scott, but you can tell I'm with Nikki Haley on this issue, no doubt. To say if you think that U.S. can just sit by while an aggressive nation conquers or invades or subjugates a smaller democratic friendly nation, if you don't think that has broad consequences, you're nuts. And if you want to see China's worst instincts come into play, their worst predatory, worst aggression come into play, let Putin win in Ukraine. And you are empowering every bad instinct in Beijing, in North Korea, in Iran. All of these folks who have real capacity to be dreadful are going to be empowered if Putin prevails in Ukraine. So it's very much in U.S. interest to push back against that kind of aggression and do what we can to help the brave men and women of Ukraine.
My question for you, it's a one-way trip in the ambulance. Are you getting the Biden train ride back out? Like, how are you getting out?
We take a train to Krakow. By the way, I've never been to Poland. I've never been to Ukraine. Most of my work's in Asia. There's a night train to Przemysl is the name of the city. Which is by Krakow. Then I fly out of Krakow back to London and then back to U.S.
Good for you, Frank.
Yeah. That's great. I have a suggestion for you and then a question as we wrap up, Frank. Right. So here we go. Suggestion is, as you raise money, you can have people contribute money to set up the playlist that you'll need as you drive into Ukraine. So
that's a great suggestion.
Some Led Zeppelin. So, it just depends on what you're feeling as you drive in, but you need some music.
I'd like that. My only fear is my friends typically have sort of excruciatingly poor taste, and they're going to come up with just the most impossible, dreadful songs that you don't want to post online. But I love the idea. I love the idea.
I would follow if you would create one on like Spotify and put like Frank's ambulance playlist. I would follow it.
My fear is they're going to get me a great guy. He's going to be a really good guy. My co-driver is going to be some British guy who's really good, and he's got the most dreadful taste in music too. So my fear is I got like 15 hours or whatever with this guy. So yeah. So
oh my God.
Yeah.
All right. So wrapping up with a question: the U.S. has at the baseline the age of 18 for voting, for political participation as a citizen. It's built in so that there's no manipulation of someone who's young. So that if they, even if you got to be 35 to run for president, so it's built in to have some experience. Do we need to start looking at an age cap for people running for office?
Oh, that's an interesting point. And look, we're at a point where I think we have two candidates. One more visible. I think Biden's got some more visible problems than Trump, but I think Trump's got a lot of problems when it comes to age. What I would say is this: I wouldn't do it with a formal age cap, but I would say I think we need to have some kind of mechanism with the delegates where it's not pure majoritarianism. It's not pure, how do you feel the week of, February 20th, do you like somebody or not? Meaning a super delegate kind of model or quasi-parliamentary model where you're letting members of Congress, Senate, governors, and so forth also participate in the process, and they bring in a little more depth, a little more historical vision. And I think, by the way, I think among the Democrats, that group of people would say we're not excited about Joe Biden. And I think among the Republicans, they'd say we're not excited about Donald Trump. So I like where you're going with this. I wouldn't do it with an age cap, but I do it with some other change to the delegate selection process.
That's interesting. So let people have their say, let them have the vote, but have some wisdom in the room of qualifying that vote.
Well, and as we know, that's how not just Britain, but that's how Germany does it. That's how all the Commonwealth countries do it. And, we don't have to be that tilt so far that way to say people don't have a vote. Let people have that vote. But also, Chuck Grassley's going to have some insight from Iowa. Kim Reynolds is going to have some insight from Iowa, and not just who shows up at one caucus one night.
Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah. We used to have that. I mean, before the populist movement, the senators were elected by state legislators. Right. So we had some of that in the past. We've gone away from it. But I'm also just from a human standpoint, very sad to see Mitch McConnell, very sad to see Dianne Feinstein.
Yeah, it's sad.
My wife constantly says, like, why are they doing this? Why aren't they at home with their families? And if you've never worked in Washington, power is the gravitational pull of power is unbelievable, I think. And
look, this is their one, they say they're great. He's a great piano player. There's only one note on his piano. You got your choice. You can either be a very old senator or a very old former senator. That's your choice. Yeah. So most people are going to choose the first, right? So Donald Trump doesn't have any other profession. He doesn't have any other way to make money, other way to get celebrity status, no other ambition in life. His one role in society today is as a professional politician. And by the way, same with Joe Biden. It's not like he's saying, well, what I always did was practice law. William Howard Taft finishes his presidency goes to Yale Law School and takes up his professorship at Yale Law School. He enjoys practicing law, right? But Biden's not ever had any other kind of job. Trump has done other things, but for the last 6 or 8 years, all he's done is this. Yeah. So this is it.
We're glad you're a Renaissance man, though, Frank.
Thanks, guys. Hey, thank you for having me on. It was a lot of fun. Good chatting.
Absolutely. Yeah. Folks, this has been the Shoe and Show. Thanks for joining us. shoeandshow.com is the website where you can grab all our great content and conversations we've had. We try to cover, everything very meticulously on footwear, but there's so much that's hitting footwear from all angles on the outside. And so we try to bring in experts and thought leaders like Frank to come in and just shed some light on what's happening so that you can better prepare. We hope you've enjoyed it. We always enjoy Frank and his clever insights and humor because we need a lot of humor in this day and age. So with that, again, thank you guys for joining us. Catch us next week. And on behalf of Matt and myself, Shoe-In is out.
Shoe-In has been brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear. For information about FDRA, visit fdra.org.